think we've all heard the expression being all in. And we used to refer to that as when we were tired or just exhausted, that, I'm all in. But now when we say all in, it means that we're totally committed to this process, or whatever it is. And so what we hear in the first lesson today from the prophet Isaiah is an invitation to the people of God to be all in. They're in exile. They have a very difficult time continuing to cope with being in Babylon. Those who knew the promised land and that were taken into exile are aging. They don't have much hope anymore of getting back to their land. There are those who have been born in exile who know nothing about it. They know what they hear. The faith cannot be freely practiced because the Babylonians are making sure that as much oppression on the Jews as possible is exercised. But they're being reminded that God is going to be doing a new thing. In fact, He is doing a new thing. Can you perceive it? Can you see what's happening? Do you understand what's going on? And probably most of them would say, no, we don't see what's going on. Here we're still sitting here in Babylon. What is it that's so great that's going on? But it's in the matter of time that they begin to hear things and they begin to understand that God very slowly and methodically through various means is getting ready to deliver this people after their 70 years of bondage and allow them to go back to their land again. And that will be the moment when they are especially going to be called to that awareness of being all in with the covenant once again. But in the meantime, they're being called upon to recommit themselves to that very covenant. The covenant that some of them may have heard about, but don't do much about anymore because they can't. And that covenant that the older ones among them had broken so many times that got them dragged off into exile. So they are being called to recommit themselves to the way that leads to fulfillment in life in union with God. They're being prepared, but they have to make a choice. They've got to decide whether they're going to be with the program or against it. And if they're not all in, then when the liberation comes, they're not going to be changed at all. They'll be happy to go back, but once they get back and see everything, they'll wonder why they ever left Babylon. So it's a call for preparation to be ready to really truly recommit themselves and trust Him. And if they trust and they believe and they listen and they look, they will begin to recognize God in their midst, things beginning to change. In the gospel passage today, we deviate from Luke and jump into John's gospel. And this is a very telling chapter because in the previous chapter in the Gospel of John, Jesus performs his, let's say, the greatest of his signs up to that point in calling Lazarus back to life. Now, Lazarus is going to end up dying again. But nevertheless, he was called out and he was really dead. This wasn't some trick that Jesus performed. Because if you remember that it says in chapter 11 of John that one of his sisters, Mary, says to Jesus, "Lord, There's going to be a stench. He's been dead for 4 days. And recounting that dead for 4 days was a certain sign that a person was dead. Truly dead. Not just unconscious, not just maybe, out of it in some way, but really, truly dead. And then the smell verifying. So Jesus does this greatest of his signs of raising Lazarus back to life. And then here we are. He's at the table with Lazarus having dinner. Martha's busy cooking, as usual, and Mary is there listening, as usual, if you think back to the story. And so here, Jesus and Lazarus are targets. They're targets for the authorities. Anytime John uses the word Jews, he's referring specifically to those among the people who were against Jesus from the get-go and who never changed their minds. So it's not all of the Jews, it's just this particular group. At any rate, they are all in their process of wanting to kill Jesus. And they got to get rid of Lazarus too, because Lazarus is the living sign that Jesus is somebody extraordinary, maybe even the Messiah. But of course, they're going to argue about that over and over again. That it can't possibly be the Messiah, because after all, we know where he's from, we know what he does, and we know who his family was. Can't possibly be the Messiah. He's not from the right place. He's not from the right line. He's not the right kind of person, because no Messiah would do the kinds of things or say the kinds of things that Jesus is saying. So the challenge becomes, are those who are hanging around, the disciples, the apostles, are they really totally committed? Because things are going to continue to get ugly as the story continues to unfold. Shortly after this, they will be at the Last Supper, and Jesus will wash their feet and will tell them about that being a sign of the humble service. And then he will talk more about himself as the way, the truth, and the life, and then about being the vine and that they are the branches. And then he will pray that he will let them know about the importance of their continuing faithfulness and being open to the Spirit, and finally praying for them before his arrest so that they would be one. All of that's going to happen shortly. The problem is that even though the majority of them, with the exception of Judas, remain in Jesus' company, they aren't totally committed. They still have their fears. And we know that because when Jesus gets arrested, everybody takes off, except for John, the beloved disciple. Everybody else goes and hides out, and we know Peter denies and all of that. Well, the importance of any of this is for you and me to remember that our following of Jesus Christ is going to always demand more of us than we think we're going to be able to give. Our faithfulness to the Lord, who is ever faithful to us, is sometimes difficult for us to give. Not that we would outrightly deny him, but there are those times when we will not express something from the perspective of our faith because we don't want to hurt somebody else's feelings. or we won't say something corrective to somebody that we know is speaking wrong or acting wrongly because we don't want to cause problems. Or we will look at our political situation, wherever you are on the spectrum, and not express from a point of view of faith how you feel about this and what ought to be happening because of your Christian faith. Not so much because of your politics, but because of our faith. How do we react to these different social situations that are going on? That's the difference between being all in and just being a spectator. And we all of us, hesitate. All of us equivocate. All of us have our fears, our struggles with this. But yet this is what we are always being called towards. And it's the project of our life to become more and more committed to Jesus and his way and his truth and him as our life. We are always being called more deeply into his life to discover just what it means to be the branches on the vine, who is Jesus Christ, who is the source of the living water, the Spirit that he wants us to have, the one who is willing to fight evil, that power over us, all the way to the cross. Jesus himself, the totally committed one, the all-in one, was willing in obedience and loving obedience to the Father to do what he did for us and for the salvation of all humankind. This Sunday marks the shift from just the concentration on Lenten practice to the passion of our Lord. The weekday Eucharistic readings will be highlighting more and more these encounters between Jesus and the authorities. And then next Sunday, as we hit Palm Sunday and begin Holy Week, then the whole mystery continues to unfold for us. So it's an invitation to examine once again our faith. Am I being the kind of disciple that Jesus wants me to be? Does my faith really inform my words and actions of every day? Or is it something that after Sunday's over, I put in the drawer until next Sunday? Or that I'm not going to let that stuff influence how I treat my neighbors, or talk about other people, or act in my life if I'm still working or whatever. I'm not going to let that stuff get in the way of me carrying out my business, carrying out my life, because that's becoming a fanatic. That's not living as a Christian. The opposite is true. And you and I are always being called to continue to go all the way with Jesus, all the way to the cross with Christ, because it's all the way to the cross with Christ that ultimately will lead to the resurrection, to the renewal of our life, and to the ultimate victory over the power of sin and suffering and death. And if you don't think that sin has power, or that evil is real, just look around. Just listen to the news. Just take into account the horrors that people can do. And then you'll understand why we have to be